All right, folks. So today we are going to kind of continue here with our conversation about the intersections of sport and the public sphere. As a quick note, the second writing commentary is due on March 6th and asks you to use the readings and lectures that we've done so far to compare and contrast two sports. Now, this can be two modern sports, an ancient and a modern sport, two ancient sports, whatever combination you want to do. Just pick two kind of sports or sporting events to compare and contrast. Now, the prompt asks you a lot of different questions, including things like what rituals surround them, who are the different audiences, how do athletes perform a kind of political purpose, what genetics or biological facets play a role in athletics. You do not need to answer all of these questions. In fact, I would say pick one of them to answer really and focus your commentary on that because you are going to be comparing two sports. So you really don't want to take on too much in the commentary. All right. So just as a quick note, keep that on your calendar. The next commentary will be due right before spring break on March 6th. All right, so let's get into our lecture for today. So last year, Swedish football star Zlatan Ibrahimovic commented that athletes should kind of stay out of politics and mentioned LeBron James by name, kind of calling him out over his recent political activism associated with the Black Lives Matter movement. Speaking in an interview for the UEFA in Sweden, the outspoken striker said it was a mistake when athletes step out of their lane. Of course, LeBron James clapped back at that, saying that there is no way he could just stick to sports when he has such a powerful voice and platform. Over the past year or so, James has been a force of social change, focusing on police brutality and racial injustice against African Americans. He was outspoken in particular about the police shooting of Jacob Blake in Wisconsin in 2020. And he worked with other NBA stars to found the More Than a Vote organization to try to get Black people out to vote during the recent US elections. In 1993, Newsweek actually published an article on this debate that Ibrahimovic and LeBron James were having about the responsibility of athletes, and it was titled I'm Not a Role Model. The feature piece draws stark attention to the important role of individual athletes like LeBron James in taking a public stand against inequalities and social injustices. So you can see in this quote behind me, this is drawn from the article in Newsweek, and they really mirror the statement by LeBron James about this responsibility of athletes because of their highly visible public platform. So, one of the big questions here is do professional athletes have a political responsibility to speak out against injustice? And this question is really at the heart of our lecture for today. So, if you're watching this at home, take a couple minutes to write down your thoughts. This can be one of the issues that you address in your commentary. If you're live, obviously we'll discuss it in class. So we often encounter the idea that politics is like out of bounds in the athletic arena. But this view is generally contradicted by a history in which sports are regularly in exchange for nation building and contentious politics, both domestically and abroad. And I think you see that in the reading that you guys had for today. Still, there's a particular demand that athletes kind of just, quote, shut up and play, which underlies a lot of the kind of resistance to political activism that we saw articulated in the LeBron James and Ibrahimovic debate. In a recent article by Christopher Towler, Nyron Crawford, and Robert Bennett III, they argued that African American sports stars who engage in political protest are especially well positioned to influence political behavior. And there may be many reasons for the potential influence of Black sports stars in particular. But at its core, this kind of uh, this kind of position really reflects the tendency of Black sporting celebrities to engage in race based protests that complement ongoing social movements. For example, the civil rights movement, or more recently, the Black Lives Matter movement. In the United States, Black celebrity activists have often been at the kind of center of debate over the appropriate role of athletes in American politics. For instance, in 1960, three-time Olympic gold medalist Wilma Rudolph declined to attend a celebration in her honor because the event would be segregated. Similarly, Muhammad Ali refused to enlist in the US Army in 1967 in objection to the ongoing war in Vietnam. Ali was convicted of draft evasion and sentenced to 5 years in prison and fined $10,000. He was also banned from boxing for 3 years. Perhaps one of the most famous protests for civil rights in which Black athletes participated on the international stage was mounted by Harry Edwards, who organized the Olympic Project for Human Rights protests in 1968 during the burgeoning Black Power movement. This human rights campaign used the Summer Olympics in Mexico to protest racism and poverty that disproportionately affected African American communities in the United States. Probably the most notable gesture of protest during the Mexico Olympics came from Tommy Smith and John Carlos, two sprinters who won gold and bronze at the Olympics. So Carlos won bronze here, and Smith won gold in the 200-meter. And they stood as medal winners on the podium at the 1968 Summer Olympics and raised black gloved fists during the playing of the national anthem. All of the medal winners that you see in the picture here, including the Australian silver medalist Nelson, are wearing the Olympic Project for Human Rights badges in support and solidarity for these struggles, civil rights struggles happening in the United States. The there's a lot of symbolism here in the image and in what Carlos and Smith are wearing. So the black glove on Smith's right hand is supposed to indicate black power, versus the black glove on Carlos's left hand is symbolic of black unity. They both took the podium shoeless to symbolize poverty in the black community. Carlos went one step further and actually unzipped his jacket, which was a violation of Olympic etiquette, and stood for solidarity with the working class in America. Carlos is also wearing beads around his neck in honor of the victims of lynching. In retribution for these symbolic acts of protest, both Carlos and Smith were kicked off the Olympic team. Another instance in which a black athlete spoke out against injustice and was punished for doing so happened in the 1960s. Um, for example, Cleveland Brown player Walter Beach. So these kind of acts of revolt by black athletes are often met with a kind of severe punishments in terms of banishment from the sport, incarceration, or even death. So what happened with Walter Beach was that he spoke out in support of the Hue revolts in Cleveland in 1967. So these revolts were led by black residents who felt disenfranchised by the limited job opportunities and segregation in the city. The Browns' owner, Art Modell, chided Beach for his comments and warned him to focus on football rather than social problems. The following summer, the Browns illegally removed Beach from the waiver list, and he actually never played in the NFL again. More recently, the Black Lives Matter movement has spawned a whole new generation of black sporting celebrities protesting state violence against African Americans. For example, African American players in the WNBA led pregame protests in 2016. As we talked about at the beginning of class, right? Four of the top players for the NBA, including LeBron James, opened the ESPY Awards by addressing the killing of unarmed black men by police. Also in 2016, San Francisco 49er quarterback Colin Kaepernick stirred controversy when he chose to kneel on the sideline during the singing of the national anthem in protest of police violence. That black athlete activists have often suffered kind of professional consequences for their protests demonstrates how white power structures threaten to punish outspoken members of racial minorities. More recent threats of similar professional penalties for Colin Kaepernick's kneeling became explicit during a political rally in Huntsville, Alabama in September 2017, when then President Trump, foretold the quarterback's professional fate, as you see in the quote depicted here. NFL owners took note, and like Walter Beach, Kaepernick was shut out from playing in the NFL the following season after his protest. So, one of the big questions that I have for you guys is, do black athletes in particular have a special responsibility to speak out for black issues? And in the same vein, right, do female athletes or women's sports teams have a special responsibility to fight against unfair treatment? Take a moment to write down your thoughts, and we'll talk about this in class. In my opinion, social issues are universal, even as they impact specific groups of people. And it shouldn't just be black NFL players who are called on to exert their power, especially when the teams that black players play for collectively carry way more power than individual black players ever will. That's just my 2 cents. But I want to hear from you guys. Okay, so there's kind of two key factors that can help us understand kind of black celebrity athlete activists in particular and their disproportionate influence on political opinion, but also their disproportionate burden to speak out against social justice. So the use of celebrity to represent black causes is particularly important because they do it without seeking political office. So it's seen as being genuine and not just a pathway to a political position. They are also particularly influential because because black athletes are well positioned to appeal to the black community and often America at large because of their kind of social capital that's brought on by fame. So for the rest of class, I want to really dive into the case of Colin Kaepernick as kind of the most recent evidence of the intersection of black athletics and political protests, and also an excellent demonstration of the way in which black athletic protests intersect with politics on the ground. So the case of Colin Kaepernick is particularly instructive for understanding the political influence of black athletes. And the context for the sports activism of Kaepernick is basically the killing of unarmed black men by police in U.S. cities, including New York, Baltimore, Ferguson, Missouri, as well as the suburbs in St. Louis. So during a preseason game in August 2016, Kaepernick chose to kneel on the sideline during the singing of the national anthem in protest, along with his teammate Eric Reed. Even though other black sports stars were similarly engaged in these kind of grassroots activism in response to police brutality, the backlash against Kaepernick was immediate, and the ire of the public really focused on him as an individual. In September 2016, according to an electronic poll, African American voters said that they liked Kaepernick a lot, about 42%, while only 2% said they disliked him strongly. In contrast, 37% of white respondents to the poll said they disliked the 49ers quarterback a lot, and 51% said they just disliked him, with only 5% saying that they liked him and what he stood for. So that's basically 88% of people disliking, 88 total percent of white Americans disliking Colin Kaepernick following his protest. In 2018, a similar poll commissioned by theundefeated.com looked again at race and how it intersected with Kaepernick's ratings. And what they showed was that the racial lines between favorable and unfavorable still stood. 80% of African American NFL fans 2 years after Kaepernick's protest viewed Kaepernick as favorable, whereas 36% of white NFL fans, only 36% of white NFL fans shared the same view. This stark polarization indicates how differently we see, view, and feel about race based issues around Kaepernick's protests. So Kaepernick became a free agent after the 2016 season and remained unsigned. In November 2017, he filed a legal complaint against the league, alleging that the league's owners had colluded to deny him employment opportunities because of his leadership and advocacy for equality and social justice. However, 49ers managers pointed to Kaepernick's performance as the primary reason why his contract was not extended in 2017. If we look just based on the numbers, there's a couple of reasons why Kaepernick should have been playing football regardless of his political stance in 2016. And these stats really poke holes in the notion that performance was the primary metric by which the NFL was making decisions. So this is a little technical, but basically Kaepernick had a quarterback rating of 49.5. So this is a rating that's out of 100, and 50 is about the average, which meant that in 2016, Kaepernick was actually tied for 21st in the NFL, which is pretty high overall. He was also 23rd in adjusted yards per passing attempt, which was ahead of other African American quarterbacks like Cam Newton, as well as highly paid quarterbacks like Eli Manning. The 49ers went from having the fifth worst record in the NFL in 2015 to actually an improvement to only having the second worst record in 2016. So under Kaepernick's performance, the Niners actually were doing better than they had been doing the previous years. Kaepernick also went 4-20 in the last 24 starts in 2016 and averaged 27 points per game, with an overall approximate value of 145 in terms of kind of his ranking. So there's quite a few notable players who had a much lower approximate value than Kaepernick, including Arizona Cardinals player Larry Fitzgerald, Joe Flacco, quarterback for the Baltimore Ravens, Michael Bennett, and Carson Wentz, all players who went on to compete in the 2017 NFL season. So why was Wentz at quarterback with a lower AV rating than Kaepernick afforded the opportunity and benefits of an NFL contract when Kaepernick wasn't? The simple answer, the NFL used Kaepernick to make a statement about their values in the same way they felt Kaepernick was using them to make his statement. Those values were pretty simple. You are an athlete, not an activist. In February 2019, Kaepernick withdrew his grievance after reaching a confidential settlement with the NFL. I want to focus on Kaepernick today for several reasons. So Kaepernick became a kind of leader of the BLM movement through his silent protest. He's the only athlete in his protest cohort to remain ousted from the profession for his protest action. The NFL settled the lawsuit, giving him damages for collusion, essentially acknowledging that there was a double standard at play. And these factors make Kaepernick the most compelling case to talk about the relationship between support for celebrity protests and individual political engagement. So, research on Black political participation suggests that group based resources, along with political and socio-demographic factors, generally explain Black political participation. To understand Kaepernick's political influence, his protest action must be placed in this kind of broader context of the protest movement he has come to represent, the Black Lives Matter movement, uh, the most prominent campaigner against state sanctioned violence and racism towards Black people. So, although Colin Kaepernick is relaying much of the same message found in Black Lives Matter movement activism, does Kaepernick's celebrity leadership move African Americans enough to evoke political engagement in this movement? That's the question I want to answer. So, a study of Black Lives Matter and Black voter participation indicates a significant positive relationship in the 2016 general election. Yet, support for Kaepernick wasn't similarly linked to voter turnout or confidence to vote in the 2018 midterm election. Even after accounting for other factors, the link between Black approval of Kaepernick and voter turnout remains pretty insignificant. In other words, variables such as political interest, college education, and BLM identity, Black Lives Matter identity, account for differences in voting behavior rather than Kaepernick's advocacy. Although this may seem surprising, revisiting Kaepernick's personal politics offers some insights here. So, in a November 2016 interview, Kaepernick expressed disgust for both Republicans and Democrats as he explained why he did not cast a vote in the 2016 election. Although his decision not to vote garnered much criticism, it does offer some explanation as to why his celebrity leadership may not be associated with Black voting behavior. Kaepernick didn't vote. Why would it garner Black voting ballots, right? In short, how some Black people feel about the Black Lives Matter movement is significantly associated with voter participation, whereas approval for Kaepernick is not associated with voter participation. So, what if we look at political participation beyond just voting? So, when examining political action beyond voting, strong approval for Kaepernick predicts significantly higher levels of political engagement in other political acts like demonstrations, attending a political meeting, contacting one's representative, or donating to a political campaign. For instance, compared to African Americans who do not express strong approval of Kaepernick, individuals who strongly approved are at least 10% more likely to have participated in politics beyond voting in the last year. This group of people is also 23% more likely to have participated in an active boycott. What this says is that support for Kaepernick is a more consistent predictor of non traditional political engagement than a Black Lives Matter identity or voting behavior. So, in summary, although approval for Kaepernick's protest is strongly related to Black Lives Matter movement, each works differently when examining Black political behavior. Whereas a strong Black Lives Matter identity is significantly associated with voting, approval for Kaepernick's protest movement is significantly associated with other political action, such as signing a petition and participating in a boycott. The Kaepernick case demonstrates that his Black celebrity activism has the potential to mobilize Black Americans to political action. This case also supports the idea that professional athletes like Kaepernick may serve not only as kind of national voices for justice, but also as important links between social movements and heightened political engagement. So, another question I want to throw out here is, do sports teams also have a special responsibility to speak out for social justice. Take a moment, write down your thoughts. For example, right, should Steph Curry have more responsibilities to speak out against police violence in the Bay Area than the Warriors franchise? I would argue that even in the cases of individual superstars like Steph Curry or Colin Kaepernick, the franchise and owners of the franchises in which the athletes sport operates really carries the same weight as individuals who keep that sport within the national and international spotlight. So the lack of responsibility placed on others and organizations when it comes to these matters of activism is deeply concerning to me. So teams, owners, and executives are hardly ever demanded to play roles in movements where the mission is to institute social change. While players have popularity, teams and owners have resources and connections and followings that are more unconditional and generational and longer lasting than most players' careers. So often, protests have been individual, hardly ever collective. Of course, there's some notable exceptions to this. For example, Stephon Clark, who was shot and killed by members of the Sacramento Police Department in 2018. Uh, in response to this, the Sacramento Kings organization made a public statement in support of Clark and his family, and they put their kind of money where their mouth is and partnered with the Build Black Coalition and Black Lives Matter. Another example of actually when sports teams stepped up is the Detroit Lions. So, Detroit Lions defensive end Ezekiel Ansah and other members of the team got attention for donating around 100,000 bottles of water to families during the Flint, Michigan water crisis. Um, we also see that the Pistons owner Tom Gore not only granted $1 million of his pledge to the Flint Now Relief Fund, but also spearheaded an initiative to raise $10 million from other private businesses to donate to the crisis. So that's all I have for you guys today. Our attendance quiz is the answer is green. So the pyramids of Giza are green today. Make sure you go on to D2L and fill out the quiz. And I'll see you guys on Thursday.